I actually thought it was a really good exam. I thought it covered most of the topics really well, and there was a really good spread of questions that allowed for all abilities of students to be able to access the exam, and some, more higher order questions to really separate those top students. But there was a lot of easier questions for the students that maybe struggled a little bit to kind of come out feeling a bit confident. I think probably the biggest complaint about the exam, if you want to look at it, is we spend so much time drilling students, particularly in Unit 4, about case studies. So particularly on the division of powers, you have to learn the Brisbane case, or you have to learn the Tasmanian Dams case, and you need to be able to talk about the, division of powers and this, that, and the other. And we've done that for the last couple of years, and for the last couple of years, there's actually been no questions that have required them to remember any of those case studies, but we've drilled it and drilled it and drilled it. So that I think there's probably a bit of disappointment that they didn't get to use that. But overall, I think most people were really happy. There was a really good mix of criminal and civil law in there, and a really good mix of questions on the referendum and some of the constitutional law things. I think it was evenly spread. So I think most people were pretty happy with it. Most of my students felt pretty confident coming out of the exam, so that was good. One of the 10-mark question in particular, on VCAT, because we've just finished covering VCAT this year in my class, and I said to my class, I can tell you, because I saw the examiner's report come out, it was a 10-mark question, and the average was like 4.5 out of 10, which is really low. And I actually thought it was a really easy question. And I said to my students, I can tell you before I actually read the examiner's comments exactly what students did wrong here. And then I went back and read it, and they did. But look, the general comments about the exam were that students generally did pretty well with the key legal terminology. I think across the board, students are mastering that. They're really getting the hang of using the command terms as well, because that's always been a big thing in legal studies, being able to know if a question's asking you to explain or discuss or analyse or evaluate, to know what they are and to be able to actually delve into that. And I think from the examiner's report, they're saying that students seem to have a pretty good handle on that now, which is really, really good to see. I think some of the things that they highlighted as areas of improvement were things, lack of understanding on the division of powers. So that's a Unit 4. So a lot of the actual areas of improvement are for Unit 4. Which is quite interesting. And just a reminder, students only need to know either a parliamentary committee or a royal commission, but you need to know it in depth. So whichever one you choose, you need to know all about it. You need to know what they are. You need to know their strengths and weaknesses. You need to have a really good example of one and some of the recommendations that have come out of it. And that was actually one of the questions in this year's exam. You needed to be able to evaluate that and actually talk about one of the recommendations. So if you haven't done that in enough depth, then you wouldn't have been able to answer that question. I think the other thing are things on the checks on lawmaking powers of Parliament. So again, Unit 4, that came up a bit. The other thing that comes up, and it comes up every single year, is making sure that you carefully read the questions. Sometimes students just read the question, they think it's asking one thing, but they haven't read it deeply enough to maybe realise that maybe there are multiple parts to the question. Or they miss a word, and that can really cost you marks. So you must use your reading time carefully, but you've really read and understood exactly what the question is asking you to do. The other thing is not putting unnecessary information in your answers. It's a waste of time. You don't necessarily get penalised for it, but you pay for it later when you're running out of time and you don't get a chance to actually write good answers because you filled up. You just, I know something about this and I'm going to tell you everything I know. Just answer the question. What does the question want you to know about it? The other thing is making sure that you are using your stimulus material. So particularly section B of the exam is all based on stimulus material. So there's 2 questions usually, and there'll be a stimulus material before the questions for each one of those, and you have to integrate it. And it's not enough just to refer to the person's name, like say, Bill might have done this. It needs to be used in a meaningful ways in your answers. So, and that's really there to separate students who have just learned a whole lot of concepts and those who are able to actually critically engage with the concepts to that and apply them to the cases and the material that are in front of you. So you need to be able to do that.
So I know we're going to get into the 2 parts of the exam in detail in a moment, but just before we do that, just in this general theme, were there any particular standout questions that were either like real really difficult or like really kind of low hanging fruit that you kind of want to mention up the top before we dig into it?
First question was super easy one because it was just a straight up burden and standard of proof question, which is great. And it's a great way to start an exam because everybody should be able to answer that question. Like, a student who's just finished Unit 1, Area of Study 1, so in Year 11, should even be able to answer that question and get full marks. It was a dead easy question. So that was a great way to start the exam and build confidence. And then there were some I thought that were quite tricky, which always are. I was really surprised actually with, I'm just trying to remember which one it was, the analysing question B, 3A I thought was a really easy one as well. But then I thought 3B started to get more difficult. And that's indicated it was a 6 marker, but again, the average mark there was 3 marks. So, that's a lot of students missing marks there, but it wasn't a particularly difficult one. It was really about future constitutional reform and referendums. So looking at the factors. And again, this is one that says analyse 2 factors. So I guess the key there is it's an analyse question, which means you need to pull things apart. And that's actually probably one of the other things that stood out a lot. In the previous years, there hasn't been a lot of analyse. This exam had a lot of analyse in it.
Let's now shift into the specific parts of the exam, into part A of the exam, and to dig into like what were the questions, or what was your take on part A, and what were the easy or the hard parts of that section?
So part A had some questions with multiple parts in it, and like I said, some of them were easy parts. So the question 3 that we've just talked about, 3A was easy. 3B, the one we've just talked about, was really hard. 3C I thought was pretty good. It was really just about the express protection of rights and the benefits and limitations of that. So it was a discussion question. So again, that's just a reminder about a discuss question means you need to talk about strengths and limitations all the time. So that's the big thing. Question 4 got a bit harder. That was an 8 marker. I often find, and I often say this to my students, and I will say it again because I think that's what happened here. The 8 markers everyone stresses about the 10 marker, but often the 8 marker is more difficult or more nuanced and has more parts that need answering. The average for that was 3.7. So again, I think that indicates again that this was the same for that one, and that was on the Parliamentary Commission or Royal Commission. And again, there were multiple parts for that. So they needed to talk about a recommendation for reform that was made by a Parliamentary Commission or a Parliamentary Committee or a Royal Commission. So it was an evaluate. So that means they need to evaluate. So you need to come up with strengths, you need to come up with weaknesses, and you have to make a value judgment. One of the big things students miss with an evaluate is the judgment part. You have to come to a decision. Do you think this is good, or do you not think this is good? There needs to be a judgment. You can write the best answer ever, but if you don't have a judgment at the end of it, you will lose a mark. Like, that's just a given. It has to be there. So the other thing people did on this question, which is really interesting, was in writing about parliamentary committees, a number of students actually confused that with the Victorian Law Reform Commission, which is a separate key knowledge dot point in the study design. So that cost a lot of students marks because they would have got a 0 if they've written about the VLRC. So again, it's just, they are similar. VLRC and a parliamentary commission do very similar things, but they are completely different bodies. So you really need to, again, that comes just down to making sure you really know your stuff so that you don't do that, because it's an 8 marker. If you wrote about VLRC and got a 0, that's 8 marks gone. And if you consider that it's double marked, it's really 16 marks gone. So that's a lot of marks to lose just from getting two things confused there. So that's probably my big thing there. I didn't think it was that hard of a question to do for students that really know their stuff. But again, you really need to know what a parliamentary commission or royal commission is. You need to have a really good example that you know inside and out so that you can do what this question asks you to do, talk about one of the actual recommendations for reform. You had to be able to do that in this question. So if you only knew general things about a particular committee, then you wouldn't have been able to give that recommendation for reform and you wouldn't have got the marks for it. So again, make sure you really give time to this stuff. It's really hard. Like I said at the beginning, I think Unit 4 is quite cramped.
Let's turn now to part B of the exam, the big hefty part.
Yeah, so I thought I quite liked it. I thought there was a lot of stimulus material, which would have thrown some students, definitely, and particularly, I think one of the things that throws students a lot is when they use legislation and case material that you wouldn't necessarily have covered in class. And you're like, oh, but I don't know anything about this particular act of Parliament. And that can throw you into a bit of a spin. But realising that you actually don't need to know the specific details about it because you've been provided with what you need to know to answer the question. Think of that. You need to read that through the lens. Big advice for Section B is because there is so much stimulus material, I would always encourage students to actually do Section B before Section A. And the reason for that is you've got 15 minutes reading time. And so you can really start to unpack that stimulus material in Section B, really get a good handle on what it's actually talking about. Read the questions, start thinking about how you can use that stimulus material in your answers, and then it's fresh in your mind and you can just do those questions straight away without having to then come back and go, oh, what was in that stimulus material again, after you've been writing for an hour and a half on something else. So that would be my big thing. So the other big thing I think is making sure that the stimulus, and this came back in the examiner's report too, I don't think the questions were particularly hard. The big issue with Section B is using the stimulus material in a meaningful way. So 1A, for instance, was talking about some of the rights that this particular person who's referred to in the case would have. They needed to be rights that would be sensible in that particular instance. I've put, that he had the right to silence, so he didn't need to say anything, defend his case, and he also had the right to be tried without unreasonable delay. But really linking it back to him and the situation that he's in. So that was really the probably big thing there for me. The other one was, so question 2 really focused on the lawmaking. So that was a good one. They had, the first question was actually on the international pressures, and this is the first time. So this was new to the study design, the impact of international pressures on lawmaking. So that was, new to the study design and question on it in the first exam. So that was really interesting to see. So again, it just makes, as if you have studied that and knew that was probably going to be easy marks for you. So it's just talking about how international pressures impact government and what they need to do with it. Pretty easy again. But again, you have to refer to that stimulus material. B, there were a few things that were done. The question was specifically asking about the role of the lower house in Parliament in lawmaking. Few students started talking about the role of the Legislative Council, and some students even talked about the Senate, which would have meant no marks. So again, read the question carefully. And then when you're talking about it, because it was to do with a particular bill that had been passed through Parliament and it contested. So basically, the Victorian Parliament passed a law. A couple actually took the government to the High Court to challenge it, saying that it was unconstitutional. So the questions basically were all to do with that. That was the stimulus material. So you needed to be able to refer back to that. So in terms of talking about the role of the lower house, needed to be things like they pass the majority of laws, because that's relevant to the case. You could have talked about forming government or debating bills or representative government, all of those sorts of things, but they were harder to link back to the stimulus material. So you need to think about, what reason can I link back to the stimulus material here? And in that case, passing bills is the easiest one, because that's what they did in that case. So that was a big thing there. 2C, easy question. It was just really explaining the difference between exclusive, concurrent and residual powers, which everybody should know. But again, linking that back to the stimulus material. Okay, so in what ways, when you're talking about exclusive, so each of those exclusive, concurrent, residual powers, what examples from the stimulus material can you use to demonstrate in those, for each of those 3 areas? That would have given you marks. So you just need to make sure that you are sticking to that. And so that's probably my big thing. So I didn't particularly think the Section B was hard. I felt there was a lot of room in Section B for students, so really high-end students, to really show their knowledge and get top marks here. So I thought there's some really, but I think it was accessible to everybody. Everybody should have been able to get something out of this. But your really strong students, this Section B was a really good opportunity for those students to really shine if they took that opportunity. So
Make those connections is what you're saying, really.
Yeah, because if you make those connections well, shows that you know your stuff, that you're synthesizing your knowledge between all the different areas, which is another key skill that legal studies really wants you to be able to do, and you will be rewarded for that in good marks. So Yeah.
So how can it's wonderful advice around the exam and great insights that you've shared around really specific examples within the exam that students and teachers can look at and reference and use some of those strategies. How can students be using your Edrolo Legal Studies course to be doing some of the things you've talked about?
I think, again, going over, so watching the videos, rewatching videos, reading the content, rereading the content, doing the practice questions, particularly the ones where we break down how to answer and where the marks are coming from. I think that's a really, like I said, that is a skill. And I think all of us have gone through and made sure that we've included some really good examples on how to break those questions down and make sure that you are maximizing the amount of points that you can get for each question. So yeah, I think just doing all of those practices, getting feedback from your teachers as well. So I think it's one thing to go out and check off on against the marking guide that I've put up on Edrolo, for instance, but then take your example answer, give it to your teacher and ask them for a second opinion. What do you think? What would you give this as a mark? I think that's a really good way to go about it as well.